couch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. When David Price was a child, he, like many of us, found himself playing about as his father worked elsewhere in the room. But what David didn't realize at the time was that all those maps and plans hanging around the office were helping his dad, Buzz Price, determine the best place to construct a little theme park called Disneyland. Not only did Buzz help Walt Disney make that determination, but he also acted as a feasibility advisor for Disney World, EPCOT, and many other theme park and entertainment complexes throughout his life. Honored as a Disney legend and with his own window at Disneyland, Buzz Price not only changed the lives of theme park fans, but many artists with his work in the formation of both CalArts and Ryman Arts. David spoke with me about his book all about his father, Buzz Stories at 30,000 Feet, and the impact of his father's legacy. All that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. David Price, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
So let's talk a little bit. Your father, in your book, which you have written called Buzz Stories at 30,000 Feet, you talk about how your father is described as a feasibility advisor. And so people get kind of an idea of your father's place sort of in Disney history. Explain a little bit about what that means for those who might not know your dad's work.
He became Walt's numbers guy. He cranked the numbers in terms of feasibility. And you have to kind of go back in time and recognize that there was a whole new kind of science and art that looked at data to provide, to help give guidance to creative decision making. Had a lot to do, for Walt, it had to do with site selection. But once a site was identified, it then came down to really examining the marketplace, understanding the marketplace, understanding the demand, understanding the capacity of a property, understanding how to size program elements to accommodate the anticipated visitation. So this was all translated into data, into numbers. And Buzz was in the right place at the right time to kind of help create the arithmetic that could calibrate and address and provide answers to some of those questions. It kind of, you have to look at it too in terms of its context. It was really kind of coming off in many ways, it was a byproduct of World War II, where data was used to measure the success of a war effort. Not only, really to understand the enemy, to understand what their capacities were, what their capabilities were, and to understand how to disrupt it. And so during the war, Dad was really doing something somewhat related, but looking at data to help guide strategy. After the war, my mom and Dad went down to Lima. He was working for Ingersoll Rand. He was selling ball bearings in the Andes. That's where my twin sister and I, we were conceived in Lima, but we were born in the Bay Area, in Oakland. And because he wanted us to be born in the States, but even more importantly, he went back to graduate school, Stanford Biz School. And that at that time, that was really a kind of emerging curriculum, looking at how data could be used to guide industrial development, commercial development. So these things were already beginning to happen, and he was there. It was an exciting time in terms of academia, because they were beginning to model and to analyze. They were creating methodology for how to address some of these questions in a mathematical framework using data. Walt Disney came around, really, he visited Stanford Business School at the SRI, Stanford Research Institute, and he was looking for somebody that could help him understand, from a feasibility perspective, some of the ideas what he was envisioning. So it was kind of like the fourth dimension to a creative vision. He was recommended by SRI. He moved the family down to LA. Walt helped him set up his business. Walt wanted him to be an outside consultant. He did not want his numbers guy to be an in-house guy, because he wanted somebody that could really speak freely and independently. And that's how he launched his business. I didn't understand any of this as a child because, I was born in 1949. So I was a child. And we were a young family. I had a twin sister. I had an older brother. I had a brother 1 year younger than me at a time, a younger sister that came later. But we were a young family. And my dad was a busy guy. But I do remember him kind of starting his office on the second floor of the garage where he had all these maps. And that was, looking back at it, that's when he was studying locations for Disneyland. And that was back in the day where, you pinned up the maps and you had Mylar sheets on top of those, and you had tapes and colored stickers, and you were, beginning to identify circulation, smog patterns, weather, different site locations, and these things were all kind of up on the wall. I had no idea really what he was doing. Our train set was in the adjacent room. My rock collection was there. Dad had a big desk that had pencils that I would sharpen, and so it was just, it was a childhood watching Dad work. Then the office moved to downtown LA, and I just kind of grew up watching, being around a successful dad in that. And what was success to a child? It meant that we had a safe, loving household in a friendly neighborhood. And I had lots of friends. And it also meant that every Christmas we were kind of the envy of all of our neighborhood friends, because we'd get a big box from Walt Disney that was filled with toys. And, that was in the 50s. So it was pretty special to get a box. It seemed like at the time, looking back at it, it felt like the box was the size of a building. We were just all so small. I don't think it was as big as I probably remembered it, but it was probably as big as a really big ice box, or a small refrigerator, and it was packed. I mean, it was all these different boxes wrapped, and it filled the entire box in terms of the volume. There was no wasted space. So you just would pull one present out after the other, and it was like an explosion on Christmas to open up that box. And that was kind of what it was like as a child.
Now, were those all Mickey-oriented toys? I mean, Walt was known, of course, for being an early merchandiser.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And it was everything that was being produced back then. So, I kind of like, it's a funny recollection, but I can imagine what it would have been like had we not opened any of it.
Yeah, you played with your retirement. Yeah, for sure.
Put it aside. Literally Christmas morning, within an hour or two, all the packages were ripped open. Everything was spread out all over the floor, and it was like Toyland. in our family room well before the movie.
Now, did you ever get a chance to meet Walt Disney in passing or anything while you were with your father, or was that never something that happened?
I certainly knew. I met a lot of the family over time, but I did have a very specific memory of meeting Walt. One time when Dad was flying back with Walt, and our family, my mom put us in the station wagon, and we all drove down to pick up Dad at the airport. And we were little kids, and this was LAX was really different back then. And you didn't get there by freeways; you took surface streets to get to the airport. And Mom took us all to the gate, and Walt and Roy, Walt Disney Walt Disney and Buzz came out. And what I remember about it very specifically was that Walt walked out through the gate, and he was holding the hand of this little black girl. And that girl was probably my age. I might have been 6 at the time or 5 at the time. She was somewhere around that age. And he walked her from the gate all the way to the front of the airport. And I think she was just a passenger on the plane. But what I remember was this gentle man holding the hand of this little girl who I remember her being black, but it was really he was holding the hand of this little girl, and he accompanied her as we all walked back to the front of the airport where we picked up our luggage. And I've always wondered whether this little girl remembers it. Did she know who he was back then, and what became of her? That was the only time I met Walt Disney.
Well, it's a good time.
Yeah, I mean, later on, I met, I knew his, Sharon Disney and Diane. I knew the daughters. I knew their children. I grew up with them. I still know the family. But I was much later, an older child, a young adult, an adult, as our lives unfolded.
Now, something that people might sort of think about your dad is being the numbers guy, that he's sort of, very dry and analytical. But it's very clear in your book that he loved the arts and he encouraged it in your household. And, your mother, she was an opera singer at one time, correct?
Correct. She was a professional singer. She came from a family. She came from a church family. So music was rooted in her upbringing. Robert Shaw, the Robert Shaw Chorale, was conductor at the Atlantic Symphony. Dad always mused the fact that he was really the famous one in the family. And he was. Robert was renowned throughout the world. He was probably one of the top 2 or 3 conductors in the world. Certainly probably number 1 when it came to choral music. We grew up around music and art.
Where did your father meet your mom?
She was a student at Pomona College, which I actually attended later in life as an undergraduate. And Dad was at Caltech getting an engineering degree. And they were both in school, and that's how they met. He was introduced to my mom by Aunt Pat, who's still alive, his older sister. A remarkable woman, healthy as a horse. And so they really met because of Aunt Pat. And it was Dad always described it as just the power of a youthful love that kind of energized them for the rest of their lives.
Now, what sort of, your mother, of course, singing was very big for her, and you guys were encouraged. What sort of artistic hobbies did your father take on, or did he have the time with all of the stuff that he was working on?
I would describe his hobbies really as being a kind of his life. The arts and music were really very much a part of the backdrop to our upbringing, and it was important to him. I'm glad that you asked the question about, what was he like in terms of as a numbers guy? Was he just a geek? Hardly. He was a very well-rounded man who, and he would be the first to say, what grounded him was really I think, a powerful romance and a powerful relationship that he had with my mom, who anchored him. Dad could be very, what's the term? He could be very self-deprecating, which kind of humanized him for the rest of us. But he was kind of anchored. So he was anchored by family. He was anchored by his involvement and his interest and his passion for the arts. And so much of his business life and his social life and his personal life, all these things kind of came together. They kind of intermingled. He had friendships that grew out of business that were deep friendships. And these things kind of intermingled with the arts. He was a founding board member, I believe the founding board president for CalArts. Others followed. But as Roy points out, in the early days of the formation of this idea of a school for the arts under one roof, Dad was very much there. He shepherded that after Walt's passing. And so all those relationships, all those interests, all those passions kind of wove together in terms of business and interests. I would say that in terms of an upbringing, in terms of what really bound us as a family, we had great holidays. Dad was a busy guy, but we would take off for the Christmas holidays for a week or 2 weeks at a time, and it would be pure family. And we skied all over Kingdom Come, and Dad was just plain fun to be with. You could spend time with him and just laugh till you cried. Particularly as we all became older, and teenagers and college kids, but he was a kick in the pants. He was really fun to be with.
Let me ask you a little bit more about CalArts, because you brought it up, and it's such a formational institution for so many people that end up inside of Disney culture in some way. And there's a wonderful story in your book about literally how much faith Walt had in your dad when it came to the creation of CalArts. And I was wondering if you would tell that little moment, because I think it's so essential to how much trust Disney had in what your dad could do.
Well, as I understood it, I wasn't there, but it's how Dad conveyed it to me and to family and friends and colleagues. But as Walt was nearing the end of his life, he turned to Dad and really asked him personally to make sure that it happened, to help make it happen. He wanted somebody there to help make that happen. And he, just as Buzz was so instrumental in helping to locate and strategically define what this new amusement park was going to be, Disneyland, he had the confidence in that Buzz could help make this happen too. This was not a one-man job by any stretch. It's never that way. But he had confidence in Buzz bringing the necessary kind of leadership and really strategic mind to the task. So that was kind of that was a covenant. I think that was a personal covenant that my dad felt. And he met it. I used to, as your parents age, you get to a point where you realize they're not going to be with you forever. And so those last 10 years of a person's life, it really is a time where sons and daughters hopefully make, you try to cover every base there is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course you can't do that, but you try, But I remember telling Dad that even though he was, even at the time, well renowned for his role in the planning of Disneyland and Disney World and other kind of major ventures of the Walt Disney companies, the thing that it might be the most lasting legacy for him could well be the school. Mm. And I said that from the perspective of, I had the good fortune of, I became an architect, and I had the good fortune of going to graduate school at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. I spent 7 years in Boston. It's where I met my wife. It's where my first child was born. And I had many times when I walked through Harvard Yard, between Cambridge, the town, and the university. And you'd go by the statue of Harvard. And this bronze statue sitting in the quad. And when you realize about the history of that school and how it too had a beginning, it had a start. It had a first class. It had a first bunch of students, hundreds of years ago. And when you think of the kind of the impact that had over time, how it pyramided out into multiple lives after lives after lives that extend to this really a pyramid of humanity, of lives that are global in nature, mm-hmm. that affect so many things in so many industries, in so many technologies, in so many ways. That's what that's what a school can do. That's what a school does over time. And I was reminding him, I told my dad, I thought ultimately that may be the thing that he would be remembered for, because it was so impactful. I mean, at the time, I didn't even comprehend. I don't think any of us did. Dad certainly had the last 10, 15 years of his life. He certainly was well recognized and honored, inducted into this and that, and a window at Disney. Well, that was after his life, but a Disney legend, a Hall of Fame at IAPA, really recognized by so many people that not only just admired him, but loved him and respected him. And it was, but I always thought it was kind of, I always thought CalArts would be something that would really, truly have legs. And I think it does. I think it will. It already has.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you, going all the way back to your childhood and seeing your dad with, those plans and all that while you sort of play. Eventually, those plans have got to turn into a theme park. So I have to imagine you remember your first trip to Disneyland.
I do, but what I remember about going to Disneyland as a child was just the magic of it. But it's the same magic that everybody is feeling. You're not walking around as a child, looking. You're doing that, having fun with your mom and dad and your siblings,
right?
But you weren't admiring him for his role in Disneyland. You were kind of lost in the fantasy of being at Disneyland.
Sure.
I mean, I remember in Frontierland. I mean, I loved going to Frontierland. I loved going to the island. My brother was a year younger. He and I would, go to Tom Sawyer's Island and get lost there, while the family members would be doing other things. But I remember in Frontierland, the old the Frito machine where you could put a quarter in or whatever, a token probably, and you get a bag of Fritos. Something that simple had so much magic to it, and it was so memorable. But we would just spend all day there, and it was a trip to Disneyland. But it wasn't associated. I didn't make the connection to Dad in the park as much as just having fun like everybody else. I became more aware of really what that all meant as I grew older, as I became a young adult, as I became a student of architecture, as I went off to graduate school. When I was at GSD, Disney World was under construction, and so that was a pretty exciting time back then. It was in the 60s going into the 70s. It was a wild and crazy time for the country at that time as well. But the construction of Disney World was a really big idea that was happening back then. Graduate schools were well aware of it. Business was, it was a huge commercial, industrial, technology, attraction-driven enterprise that was underway. So it was like a whole new town, a whole new city that was being built. So that's when I began to start becoming really cognizant and aware of what was happening and what was significant about it.
Now, something that your father used to sort of explain all his, what he ends up calling in his own book, roller coaster math, like the whole process of figuring things out, was sort of it was a 2-day sort of meeting with different people when he would go and meet with them. And he would call these, I believe the term is charrette, correct?
He called them a planning charrette.
Yeah. And a charrette is a term that he actually stole from you and your background in architecture, right?
Well, I think, I'm a real believer that creative ideas often occur kind of simultaneously through different minds. This happened in the scientific world on numerous occasions, but I do remember specifically the time when my dad called me. That was back in the day when you wrote letters, by the way. We didn't, you didn't pick up the phone always, or you didn't use the phone in quite the same way. But I remember talking to him over the phone about this thing he was talking about, which was he was really excited about beginning to, and I think he was sharing it with me because he knew it would interest me, about this technique that he was using, that he'd really learned from Walt by participating in it, where he would gather, he would assemble a small cadre, a small group of people with different backgrounds, different expertise, to examine a set of questions, a set of issues, try to solve a problem or problems. And it was like a workshop, as he was describing it. And that's when I mentioned to him the term charrette. I said, "Well, Dad, this is what we're calling it at GSD." And we would have these design charrettes, planning charrettes, and sometimes they'd be all night, or they'd be over several days. A very focused kind of design session, condensed into a finite timeline, where you would address a design question or questions. And I said, "That's a charrette." And I explained to him that it's a French term. It's a French word that was used that referred to a cart. Back in the day, those carts had been used to carry the heads of victims from the French Revolution. Those same carts were used to carry drawings by the art students and the architectural students. They would use these carts rather than backpacks. They had charrettes, these carts to drag their tools and their books and their things along. So I told them it was called a charrette, and that's also, I mean, later in life, and I write about this in my book. That's really joining the charrette efforts with Buzz was really when I began to truly appreciate and understand my father as a creative thinker, as a creative businessman. And it was not just him in a charrette, but it was really the community of people that he would pull together. Just a bunch of bright, articulate, creative thinkers. And to be in that as an architect, as an emerging professional person, I knew the importance of it. And I knew how fortunate I was to be a part of that. And I learned quickly how to carry my own bucket and how to contribute. So it was a wonderful way of getting to know my dad back then. And it carried on through much of his life and our professional lives. I had many, many times when I would join him. I wasn't in all of his charrettes. He would pull teams together for different assignments and pull different folks together that could bring something to that discussion. But I know he liked working with me, even though I was his son. He was always kind of it was kind of funny, but he was very respectful of the kind of the integrity of the process and kind of letting people know that his son was there, not because he was his son, but David is doing this or David is doing that, and he brings something. And I really enjoyed learning how to carry my own bucket during that process. And I loved the people that I got to know through that process. That book came together in large measure because of the charrette experiences and the people I got to know. The real genesis behind that book was something else I was writing. About 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. I mean, I enjoy writing, and I started writing about my own life. It was like a journal, and I would kind of explore and discover, things about myself by doing that. And I wrote a lot. And I realized, and I created something that was really I did it for my kids more than anything else. And I called it Stories from Home and Abroad. And I wrote this book and I gave it to my kids. So it's, and it starts from my early childhood all the way to the present when I had finished writing it. I realized, though, that as I wrote it, as I got further into it, how much I'd been writing about my dad in it. And so I started pulling certain parts out of it about my dad. And I started sharing it, those stories with my colleagues that I knew from the charrette. So I shared stories with Nick Winslow and Mike Lee and Sherry Dalrymple and Bob Rogers, and I encouraged them to share their stories. Of course, this is all happening at that point after Dad had passed, really almost 10 years after Dad had passed. Well, 7 or 8 years after Dad had passed. And so I started getting their stories, and I was encouraging to do that. And some I had to lean on a little bit more, but they were so glad to be able to do it and welcomed it. And so I started getting their stories. And as they started coming in, and I began working all of this together. I began at a certain point. I realized I had the makings of a book, and that kind of pretty much how it came together. So I didn't really start off to write about my dad, but that's what I ended up doing when I was writing about myself. And then there was a kind of a turning point where I realized I wanted to write a book about my dad, and I had some wonderful dear colleagues who were eager to participate in that. And it's in a lot of ways, it's a collection of love letters.
Well, and of course, as you said, a lot of those come from their experiences with charrettes and things of that nature. And you mentioned carrying your own bucket and doing your own, and that's for sure. Because one of the things that's interesting about your architectural career is you also designed your parents' Palm Springs home, right?
I did.
How was your dad on the other side of the table as a client?
That was, well, there's you have to look at that. You have to put it in context. It was my first house. Hadn't designed a custom home up until then. I was a young architect, still very, very green behind the ears. But they certainly weren't going to turn to anybody else. And I was totally inspired to be able to do this with them. And it was interesting. I mean, I was really encultured with having two parents that I knew loved each other their whole lives. It's not to say they didn't have challenges. They didn't have moments. I lost an older brother. So one of the things they shared in life is grief. They, in a childhood accident. So they learned how to cope with that. But having two parents that modeled love was really something that was very enculturing for me. And sure, there were plenty of home arguments and, drama and all that stuff. But I never, ever doubted that. So when I went into this exercise of designing a home for these two people, I kind of naively thought that they would agree on most things. Well, they didn't always agree. And they would, they could become each very adamant and very, very specific and very articulate, suggesting things that were like diametrically opposed. And that's when Dad would just kind of at a certain point say, I don't care, go solve it. And so there was, we all recognized this. The three of us, we knew this. And it made for lots of laughter. And when things got kind of intense at times, we would open a bottle of wine and have a glass of wine to cool the issue. But that was my big surprise, was just knowing that, discovering how they differed on certain things and how passionate they were about it. But I also really appreciate having a client. I started my own company with two jobs. One was a custom home for my parents, and the other was a television station for Retlaw. Retlaw is Walter spelled backwards, and it was the holding company for the Walt Disney family. And they had a television station up in Monterey, and they hired me to design their television station. So I was a young architect designing a custom home that I'd never done a custom home. And I was really, in large measure, and I was hired by Sharon and Diane to design a television. Two very smart, savvy ladies, dear family friends, but smart ladies. And they too knew that I had never designed a television station. But what I really held on to over the years was a deep appreciation for them having confidence in me, even though they knew I didn't have the a list of experience, for doing something like that. They had confidence in me that I could figure it out. And that's something that you really value with people that believe in you. It is such I can't imagine going through life, how difficult it would be to go through life and not have people around you that believed in you. I had the good fortune of having two parents that believed in me, and I was introduced to people along the way that believed in me, and that is a form of acknowledgement that is very, very powerful. We live in a time where the value of acknowledgement is not always appreciated by other parts of society towards other people. We're living in a very profound time right now. This whole Black Lives Movement, really at its core, yes, it's about a legacy of slavery in our history that has led to systemic forms of racism. But at the core of it is the failure for too many years to not acknowledge the suffering that came from that. And it's that failure of acknowledgement that probably is what hurts the most. And you would think that would be the easiest thing to flip. Not so. But I think one of the exciting things that's going on now, and that in this time that we're living in, this moment, is that we are, I think, as a society, as a country, finally coming to a point in time where we are beginning to acknowledge it. We're still in the middle of all this. But I think that's really what's happening. My life, I never had anything that was even close to that kind of heartache. I grew up with parents that were in a home full of love and support. Yeah, my dad could drive me nuts as a teenager. He was mostly good at just asking a critical question. And when I didn't have the answer as a child, that would be frustrating. But he always knew how to he always knew how to ask the critical question. He didn't tell me what to do or not to do. He would know how to go to the question. Later on in life, knowing the question was a powerful tool as an architect, as a strategic thinker, is knowing that what the underlying the key question is really was instrumental. So I've had so many blessings in my life that I'm very, very, I'm really grateful for. My mom was as much a star in our lives as my dad.
Let me ask you about another relationship of your father's. That is, you mentioned earlier him having relationships that started from business and then grew deep roots outside of that. And I think one of those easily would be another Disney legend, Marty Sklar, who people know of course, as being an Imagineer and being a real mind behind EPCOT and its creation. Tell me a little bit about their decades-long friendship. What connected your father and Marty, and then of course, what led them to sort of be both founders of Ryman Arts?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I love talking about it. Um, Marty and Leah were, in my experience growing up, they were one and the same. I mean, they were together. I think Buzz knew Marty really from work initially, as you would expect. In many of those planning sessions, working sessions, Marty was there at Disney. Marty too was one of these young college kids. He was still a student at UCLA when he was hired by Walt to start a newspaper for Disneyland. Walt felt like Disneyland needed its own newspaper, and he hired Marty to produce that newspaper. So they kind of tracked together. They were both real creative thinkers, but they came at it from different backgrounds. Marty was the ultimate wordsmith, but it wasn't about just throwing words together. It was always it was about building a story, a consistent story, a story with depth, a story that the entire team could understand and connect to, the whole creative team. So Marty was kind of that narrative talent that was he was a narrative leader in making in giving the story legs. And Buzz was coming into it with a story that was really built around math and data, but it really which reinforced the sustainability of the story. So, you had two really bright minds. There's a generational difference, not a big difference. I always thought of Marty and Leah as kind of somewhere in between me and mom and dad age-wise. Marty was a little bit older than that. They were probably, I'm guessing 12, 15 years younger than mom and dad, maybe 10 years younger, probably 10 years younger. So we just kind of grew up with Marty and Leah, kind of, they were part of the family background of gatherings. Sharon would be there. Marty and Leah would be there. All these other family friends that were kind of part of the, participated in DAFCA, Disney Artists, that supported the arts, eventually kind of gave rise to Ryman Arts, an arts education program that was put together following the passing of Herbie Ryman. That was Marty and Leah, mom and dad, Sharon, and Herbie's sister. And they started small, and they put together a small class at SC for high school kids to learn how to draw and paint. Like a dozen kids. And it's grown into something that now has maybe 6,000 kids that have gone through it. And really, it's been quite transformational. I sit on that board. So that was it's a really good example of how, really for Marty as well, it's just as true for Marty and Lee as it is for Annie and Buzz, where their business life was interwoven with a social and a personal life, really in a set of values and beliefs that were integrated, that were connected, and so they all kind of joined in that together, and they knew how to have fun making that happen. So as kids, we kind of grew up around a bunch of fun adults.
Well, as we finish up here, I want to ask, what's some piece of advice that you still find yourself using in your creative endeavors that you got from your father?
Wow. Well, something I'd like to answer that by really what I'm doing right now.
Sure.
We're all living in a very unexpected moment in time. This is as difficult a time for the leisure, entertainment, attractions industry as has ever been encountered in our lifetime. And I'm not alone in that. That's impacted millions of people. It's a global situation. But really, it comes after 10 to 20 years of sustained expansion in the entertainment world with regard to attractions, where it's truly a global enterprise, a global industry, and there's a whole new set of players, no longer just driven by Disney, but there's Universal and Cedar Fair, and a whole cadre of entertainment companies out there now. And really, clearly the pandemic has impacted all aspects of life as we knew it up to that point in time, where the impacts were felt, and it's challenging. It's going to be challenging as we try to find effective ways of moving through that process. And what I've done on my end is, the work that I thought I was stepping into in March, just abruptly came to an end. There was a second week for me personally that was really, but for so many people that I knew, the second week of March was kind of a cascading week where so many things kind of shut down. And I wanted to make use of my time. Dad was a pretty industrious guy, and he never really stopped until he wore out, just from age. I've tried to make special use of this time, and I started writing. What I've been doing over the last 3.5 months is doing a tremendous amount of writing. I call it my pandemic walking journal. So I do a lot of walking. I do a lot of writing, and I do a lot of drawing. And all of those kind of come together in this book. And I have absolutely no idea but it's a collection of stories. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. But I'm using that to really kind of make my days useful and productive, and I enjoy it a great deal. And so, how does that relate to my dad? He wouldn't be one for sitting around and doing nothing or sitting around and complaining. He certainly would have lost patience with a lot of things. I posted something recently on Facebook called Racism by the Numbers, which paraphrases his book. And basically, what I posted there was, I said, folks, there's too many people that are not that don't recognize the legacy of slavery and the impact it's had in terms of systemic racism. And I said, all you really have to do is look at the numbers. Dad would have looked at the numbers. He would be looking at the numbers today. And he would be saying, if the data is not acceptable, if the imbalance that exists between black and white is not in balance, and in fact does reflect inequity and inequalities, then we should be doing something to improve performance. And I think it's one of the strongest cases you can make because it's very pragmatic. When you talk about racism, everybody has an opinion. And unfortunately, too many people are in silos. We're all in silos in one form or another. But if you look at the data speaks. And we ought to be, as Americans, trying to find ways to perform better as a society. And we should be using the data. We should be looking at the numbers and having an honest conversation, a recognition that performance can be improved upon, and really exploring avenues for making that happen. So I really do feel that that's how Buzz, Dad would be looking at it. It's how my parents would be looking at it. It's really how the creative industry looks at it, So I'm using this time to kind of write and draw about the time that we're in, just in response to the time that we're in. And I find that really helpful for me personally, because it kind of it gives me a sense of purpose to a period that really where there's a lot of despair and really a lot of grief. We have to find ways of turning grief into love. Those are just words, but that's really the challenge. My parents lost their first child, their first son, Stevie. I was 6 years old. Stevie was 9. When my son was born and I saw him for the first time, I never had a real comprehension of the level of grief that my parents went through until I saw my first child. And it was a profound sense of deep, deep empathy that I felt for my father at that moment. As it was as powerful as just knowing that I was a father. But he turned grief into action, into creative pursuits, into love. I mean, he did this with my mom. He'd be the first to say he didn't do it alone. But that's what we have to do. We have to find a way to in this moment that we're all living in, which is really filled with grief in different forms. You grieve an industry that hurts. You grieve for the people in restaurant businesses that hurt, and all walks of life. And we have to find ways of turning that around. And so I think we do it by the numbers, and I think we do it by turning to love. Simple ideas that because we're human beings and complex, we don't always succeed at doing that.
Well, David Price, thank you so much for coming on Dreamfinders. I appreciate it.
You bet. It's been my pleasure.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. Thanks so much to David Price for chatting with me, and you can pick up his book Buzz Stories at 30,000 Feet on Amazon or visit thebuzzway.com to preview the first chapter and order the book there. Dreamfinders is edited by Shannon Mickelson with quality control by Ben Harris. It's hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Our podcast artwork is provided by J.P. Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating review on Apple Podcasts. It means a lot and gets the word out. Also, if you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@WDWNT.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.